Under the blistering sun of Oaxaca's rugged highlands, the mountains had always seemed eternal, mute witnesses to centuries of human history, stone guardians standing above villages that clung to the valleys below. The year was 1879, and a group of miners worked tirelessly in a secluded gorge, a day's travel from the nearest town. Their task was simple in theory, but brutal in practice: to carve pathways into the mountain in search of silver veins, rumored to lie hidden within its belly. Pickaxes rang against the stone, shovels bit into earth, and the air was filled with dust so thick it clung to skin and hair, like a second layer of life. The men, most of them indigenous Mixtec laborers, had grown accustomed to the rhythm of sweat and silence, broken only by the occasional murmur of prayer. For in Oaxaca's mountains, one never dug without first acknowledging the spirits that dwelled within. An elder among them had even cautioned before work began that the mountain was not eager to yield its secrets. "The earth does not like to be opened," he warned, "and if she gives you something, it is because she wants to see what you will do with it." His words were taken with a grain of salt, as warnings from the old often were, but more than one miner carried a rosary tucked beneath his shirt. On the 12th day of excavation, as dusk descended and the men's lanterns cast long, trembling shadows across the jagged walls, the sound of steel striking stone changed. Instead of the dull, stubborn resistance of granite, the pickaxe met something that rang hollow, almost brittle, as though it had struck against a shell. The miner who had made the discovery froze, his hands trembling as the vibration ran up the wooden handle into his bones. He paused, looking at the others, who immediately sensed the shift. Work halted. Even the cicadas outside seemed to still, their chorus silenced by the strange echo. The men gathered around the site, their breath shallow as the lanterns illuminated a faint outline within the rock. It was not the jagged irregularity of mineral veins, but a smoother, almost symmetrical form. Chisels replaced pickaxes, and with careful hands they began to chip away the encasing stone. As fragments fell away, shapes began to emerge. First what looked like the curve of a shoulder, then the delicate outline of a small hand, fingers curled inward as if in eternal slumber. When the final layer crumbled, revealing the entirety of the figure, the men stumbled backward in disbelief. Embedded within the mountain wall was the form of a child, no larger than a newborn. Yet this was no ordinary fossilized bone or calcified remnant of ages past. The infant was intact, carved of stone, yet detailed with such impossible precision that it seemed alive. Its eyelids were shut softly over what should have been eyes, its lips pressed together in a serene expression, its tiny fingernails etched clearly into the stone surface. The body was curled slightly to one side, as though asleep, wrapped by nothing but the embrace of the earth itself. The air inside the mine grew heavy, as though the discovery had shifted its weight. No one spoke at first. The oldest miner, a man named Mateo, fell to his knees and crossed himself, whispering hurried prayers. Another spat on the ground and muttered that it was a bad omen. A few stared, entranced, unable to look away. For though it was unmistakably stone, there was something disturbingly lifelike about it, the sense that if one watched closely enough, the baby's chest might rise and fall, drawing unseen breaths. Word spread quickly to the village below. By the following day, dozens had gathered at the mouth of the mine, carrying candles, herbs, and offerings. Some saw the child as a divine miracle, a sign that the Virgin herself had placed in the earth. Others whispered of curses, of children born of stone, who heralded famine and death. Mothers clutched their infants tightly, warding off unseen forces. The local priest was summoned, and upon seeing the fossil, he declared it a sign from God. Though his trembling hands betrayed his own uncertainty, he ordered it to be carefully extracted and brought to the chapel, where it could be kept under holy watch. But extraction proved nearly impossible. Tools shattered against the stone shell, as though the child was harder than the surrounding mountain itself. Even iron chisels snapped, their edges dulled uselessly. Yet what unsettled the miners most was not the resistance of the material but the strange sensation of warmth that radiated from it. When touched, The stone baby was not cold like rock should be, but faintly warm, like flesh kept under a blanket. One miner recoiled after pressing his palm to the chest, swearing that he felt the faintest pulse beneath the surface. Rumors spread faster than fact. By the week's end, the mine was abandoned. Families whispered that to dig further was to tempt the wrath of gods or demons. Children woke in the night screaming, pointing toward the mountains, insisting that they heard crying. Dogs barked endlessly at the mine's entrance, refusing to go near. A midwife in the village claimed that during a birth she attended, the newborn spoke a single word, "Hermano," brother, before falling silent, its eyes strangely fixed toward the direction of the mine. By now, outsiders had begun to hear of the phenomenon. A group of traveling scholars from Mexico City arrived, eager to classify the find. They approached the fossil with scientific detachment, photographing, sketching, and measuring. Their notes described it as a petrified specimen, possessing organic resemblance, yet composed of igneous material. But their detachment fractured when they attempted to take a fragment for analysis. One of them raised a hammer and chisel, struck once, and the tool shattered. At the same instant, every lantern flame flickered violently, plunging the mine into darkness for a breathless second. When light returned, several swore the baby's lips had parted slightly, as though exhaling. The scholars argued late into the night. One claimed it was an impossibly preserved fossil from an unknown epoch, perhaps evidence of a lost species. Another insisted it was a natural stone formation coincidentally resembling a child, yet none could explain the heat it emitted, nor why their instruments failed to scratch its surface. And when on the third night, one of their party disappeared without a trace, his bedroll empty, his boots left neatly beside it, several refused to remain another hour in the village. Still the fossil remained, half buried in the mountain, half exposed to the air like a secret reluctantly revealed. Villagers continued to visit, leaving offerings of maize and milk, as though feeding a child that had never truly been born. Some claimed they saw its eyes twitch beneath the stone lids. Others swore that when they prayed near it, they heard faint whispers in Nahuatl, a language they did not speak but somehow understood in their bones. And so it lingered there, suspended between faith and science, between stone and flesh, between curse and miracle, a child of the earth that did not belong to any known past, its mystery sealed in silence and stone. The miners never returned to that vein, and the mountain grew quiet once more. But in the village unease took root. Parents held their children closer, priests doubled their prayers, and no one could shake the feeling that in the bowels of the mountain, something ancient had awakened, something that had been waiting patiently in its cradle of rock for centuries, perhaps millennia. For though the fossil's eyes remained closed, every man, woman, and child who stood before it swore the same thing in hushed tones after leaving the mine, that the baby was not asleep, it was only pretending. The fossil was carried out of the mine with great caution, wrapped in layers of cloth and straw, as though it were a fragile newborn instead of an indestructible stone. Men whispered prayers as they moved it, some averting their eyes, others daring to look upon it one last time before it disappeared into the hands of the priest and scholars. The journey down from the mountain was slow, a somber procession watched by villagers who lined the paths in silence. Mothers clutched their children, farmers crossed themselves, and old women pressed herbs against their lips in protection. By the time the fossil reached the heart of the village, the people had already given it a name, El Niño de Piedra, the stone baby. In the small chapel, it was laid gently upon the altar, replacing the carved figure of the Virgin that normally sat there. The priest's voice echoed in the stone building as he declared that God had placed this child within the mountain as a message. It is not for us to doubt, he told the people, but to guard it with reverence. Yet his words could not silence the unease that ran like an underground current through the villagers' heart. Candles were lit around the altar, but they flickered strangely, bending away from the child rather than toward it. The air inside the chapel grew stifling, heavy with the mingling scents of wax and incense, and yet many claimed they felt a faint breeze against their cheeks as they stood near the fossil, as though it exhaled. News traveled quickly beyond Oaxaca's hills. Within weeks, outsiders arrived, scientists from Mexico City, collectors of oddities, even fortune seekers who thought the fossil might be worth a fortune if smuggled north. The scholars who had first studied it returned with more instruments, their eyes gleaming with ambition. They erected a tent beside the chapel and filled it with boxes of equipment, hammers, chisels, magnifying glasses, notebooks, even an early camera that clicked and flashed as they took photographs of the strange child. The villagers watched uneasily as the men in spectacles and tailored coats crowded around their sacred find. The scientists spoke in rapid Spanish, dismissing whispers of curses and miracle. "It is merely geology," one said confidently, tracing the contours of the fossil's head with a gloved finger. "Mineral deposits, perhaps from water crystallization. The resemblance to an infant is a coincidence of nature." His companions nodded, but their words did little to quiet the villagers' fear, for the people had seen too much already. The warmth, the pulse, the way children woke screaming in the night. Coincidence could not explain such things. When the scholars attempted their first experiment, a crowd gathered outside the chapel, pressing against the doors to hear what was happening. Inside, a man lifted a sharp chisel, its edge freshly honed, and positioned it against the fossil's tiny foot. He raised his mallet, struck once, and the steel fractured with a sharp crack. The broken chisel clattered across the altar steps. Gasps erupted, but before anyone could speak, every candle in the room went out at once, plunging the chapel into total darkness. A silence followed, broken only by the sound of someone stifling a scream. Then slowly, the flames returned, not from matches or flint, but by themselves, as though reignited by unseen hands. When the light returned, the fossil appeared unchanged, but several swore they saw its mouth parted slightly, lips no longer pressed shut. The priest fell to his knees, whispering prayers with trembling hands. The scientists laughed nervously, insisting that the candles had been extinguished by a draft, but their pale faces betrayed their unease. From that moment, divisions grew. The scholars insisted on continued study, while the villagers begged for the fossil to be reburied. "It does not belong in our world," one elder warned. "It belongs to the earth, and we must return it before it remembers what it is." The priest, torn between faith and fear, sided with the scholars, though he insisted that prayers be said before each experiment. More tests were attempted, though none yielded answers. When they tried to weigh the fossil, the scale bent under a weight far greater than its size suggested, as though the stone carried not only mass but something deeper, heavier, unfathomable. When they placed it in a basin of water, expecting it to sink, it floated for several seconds before finally submerging, leaving a trail of bubbles that sounded eerily like a sigh. When they pressed a heated iron rod against it, instead of scorching or cracking, the stone glowed faintly, like embers in a hearth. At night, the village changed. Infants would wake and cry in unison, all at the same hour, as though commanded by some unseen signal. Mothers whispered that their children spoke strange words in their sleep, words in tongues no one taught them. Men walking home from the cantina swore they heard soft weeping from inside the locked chapel, though when they entered, the fossil remained silent, its lips pressed closed once more. The scholars documented everything in meticulous notes, yet their journals, preserved years later, show an odd transformation in tone. At first, the writing is precise, clinical, filled with measurements and theory, but gradually, the language shifts. Paragraphs, describing not the fossil itself, but the sensation of being near it, the dreams they began to have, the unease that settled in their bones. One wrote of seeing the fossil move in the corner of his eye, though when he turned it was still. Another described hearing the faint sound of a heartbeat whenever he pressed his ear to the stone. By the final entries, their notes were rambling, sentences repeated over and over. "The child is not dead. The child is waiting." The villagers grew restless under the shadow of the fossil. Harvests began to fail inexplicably. Goats gave birth to stillborn kids. Rivers ran lower than usual despite rains. People whispered that the child was drawing life from the valley, feeding on what belonged to them. A fever spread through the village, taking infants first. Mothers wept in the chapel, pleading for the fossil to release their children from its grip. The priest doubled his prayers, sprinkling holy water upon the stone, but some claimed the droplets never touched its surface, evaporating before they landed. The conflict came to a head one night when a group of villagers, armed with torches and shovels, stormed the chapel. They intended to seize the fossil and bury it deep within the mountains where no man would find it again. But when they reached the altar, they stopped, frozen by a sound that echoed through the building. It was faint, but undeniable, the sound of breathing, slow and steady, coming from the stone baby. One by one, their torches dimmed, until the room was lit only by moonlight streaming through stained glass. The villagers dropped their tools and fled, refusing to return. The scholars stayed longer, determined to uncover the truth, but their numbers dwindled. One vanished, after walking into the forest, leaving his boots neatly by his tent. Another was found in the river, his body untouched but his expression twisted in terror. The survivors grew gaunt and paranoid, muttering about the child's eyes opening at night. Eventually, the last of them abandoned the village, leaving behind crates of equipment, broken tools and their scattered journals. And yet, through all of this, the fossil remained untouched, unbroken, its stone eyelids shut. To outsiders, it was a curiosity, a story too strange to be real. To the villagers, it was a presence, one they could not rid themselves of. They still brought offerings, corn, milk, small trinkets to appease it, placing them before the altar in trembling silence. Some claimed that when they did, the crying of their children stopped, if only for a while. But there was one detail, whispered only among those who dared to stand near the fossil at night, that the warmth it radiated was growing stronger, like a fever spreading through stone. And sometimes, if one pressed a hand to its chest long enough, they swore they felt the faintest movement, not a breath, not a heartbeat, but the stirring of something within, as though the child was slowly, patiently learning how to wait. The decision to move the fossil from the chapel into Oaxaca City was not taken lightly. By 1880, the villagers were divided almost evenly between those who wanted it destroyed or buried again, and those who had come to see it as a holy relic that must be protected. Priests from neighboring towns had arrived, offering differing opinions, while officials from the capital insisted that it was a matter of science. Finally, soldiers were sent to escort the fossil down from the mountains, their boots clattering against cobblestones as they pushed through the anxious crowd gathered at dawn. Mothers held their children high so that they might glimpse the strange object before it was carried away, some spitting on the ground to ward off curses, others whispering desperate prayers for blessings. The fossil was placed into a wooden cart lined with straw and iron straps, as though it were a dangerous animal being transported rather than a child of stone. 2 oxen pulled it slowly down the narrow road, and villagers followed at a distance, murmuring among themselves. For the first hours the journey seemed uneventful, the cart wheels creaking steadily as soldiers marched beside it. But by mid-afternoon, as the procession wound through a canyon path, unease spread among the men. The air had grown unnaturally still. Birds that normally flitted along the ridges were absent. The oxen strained against their yokes, snorting and stamping nervously. Then one of the soldiers at the rear looked into the cart and swore he saw the fossil's eyes flicker open. He shouted, startling the others, who rushed to peer in. The fossil appeared unchanged, its stone lids shut, its lips sealed. The priest accompanying the caravan scolded the soldier for blasphemy, but the man refused to march another step, crossing himself wildly and insisting he had seen the truth. As arguments erupted, one of the oxen suddenly reared back with a violent cry, snapping its harness. The beast bolted down the path, crashing into rocks, until its neck broke with a sickening crack. Dust and shouts filled the canyon. In the chaos, no one noticed immediately that 2 workers assigned to walk alongside the cart had vanished. When calm returned, the soldiers searched frantically up and down the canyon. There was no trace of the missing men, not a footprint, not a scrap of clothing, not even a cry heard when they disappeared. It was as though the earth itself had swallowed them whole. The priest urged them to continue, declaring that evil sought to test their faith. The captain of the guard reluctantly agreed, but unease settled over the company. That night, camped beside the road, no one slept well. Some swore they heard soft cries in the darkness, like the whimper of an infant, echoing off the canyon walls.
Back in the village, life did not return to normal. Even though the fossil was gone, families complained of sleepless nights. Babies who once slept peacefully began waking at the same hour each night, shrieking with terror. Mothers reported that when they went to comfort them, their infants did not recognize them at first, staring past their faces, as though looking at something behind them. A few women claimed their children whispered words in their sleep, words in Nahuatl, though the families no longer spoke that language. When questioned, the mothers insisted they understood the words without translation. The babies, they said, were speaking to something waiting in the mountain. Fear turned quickly to hysteria. Fathers forbade their children to play outside after dark. Farmers found their goats huddled against fences, refusing to graze. Dogs barked ceaselessly, their eyes fixed toward the north, where the fossil had once lain. Rumors spread that the missing workers had not disappeared, but had been taken into the fossil itself, trapped inside the stone shell to feed whatever life still pulsed within it. Meanwhile, the caravan trudged slowly toward Oaxaca, but unease followed it like a shadow. One scholar traveling with the company noted in his journal that he felt watched during every step of the journey. His dreams became plagued with images of stone corridors and endless cries echoing in the dark. Another soldier confessed to hearing the sound of breathing from the cart when he kept night watch. By the time they reached the outskirts of the city, half the men were muttering that they had seen the baby's chest rise and fall as though drawing shallow breath. In Oaxaca, word of the arrival spread quickly, and a large crowd gathered to see the curiosity. The fossil was placed in the university for study, and professors gathered in excitement, dismissing the frightened tales of the soldiers and village. Yet when the object was unwrapped in the lamplit hall, an unsettling hush fell over the room. Even the scholars could not deny the uncanny detail of the form, so lifelike it seemed cruel to call it a mere stone. Its small hands were curled, as if gripping invisible threads of air, its lips closed tight but faintly moist-looking, as though they might part to speak. That night, 2 guards stationed at the university vanished. Their rifles were found leaning against the wall, their boots neatly placed beside the door, but the men themselves were gone. Their families swore they had never abandoned duty in their lives. Panic spread among the staff, and though the professors still attempted to dismiss the disappearances, they whispered among themselves of the soldiers who had vanished earlier. It was too many coincidences, too close together. Back in the mountain village, the children's disturbances worse. Parents claimed their babies sometimes sat up in their cradles with eyes wide open, staring unblinking for hours as though waiting. Some infants began to hum strange melodies in tones no child should know, low and mournful songs that unsettled even the bravest men. The village midwife confided to the priest that she had delivered a child whose first breath came out not as a cry but as a whispered word, "Hermano, brother." The infant lived only a day, its skin pale as stone before it grew cold. The priest buried the body in secret to prevent panic, but the story leaked anyway, feeding the growing dread. As weeks passed, the people began to connect every misfortune to the fossil's removal. Crops failed, in unusual patterns, whole patches of maize withering overnight while neighboring fields thrived. Rivers dropped lower than in living memory despite steady rains. Some whispered that the child of stone was calling out for brothers and sisters, draining life from the valley in hunger. Others insisted it was a curse, punishment for disturbing what was never meant to be unearthed. Either way, the disappearances weighed heavily on everyone's minds. In Oaxaca, more unsettling events occurred. A student assigned to sketch the fossil fainted during his work, claiming afterward that the infant had opened its eyes and looked directly at him. He left the university the following day and never returned. A janitor cleaning the hall reported hearing crying echoing down the corridors late at night, though no babies were anywhere near the building. Soon the staff refused to remain alone in the room where the fossil was kept. The journals of the scholars reveal their descent into obsession. One wrote that he could no longer tell whether his dreams belonged to him or to the fossil. Another claimed that when he pressed his ear against the stone surface, he heard voices whispering in Mixtec, urging him to bring more children. Most chilling of all, a note scrawled in the margin of a professor's notebook read, "The child is breathing, and it grows stronger each day." By now word of the fossil had spread beyond Mexico. Foreign collectors expressed interest in acquiring it, while local authorities debated whether to keep it in Oaxaca or send it to the capital. But each time an attempt was made to transport it again, something went wrong. Wheels shattered, oxen collapsed, men fell ill or disappeared. The fossil never left Oaxaca City. In the mountain village, parents continued to fear for their children. Mothers sang lullabies every night not only to soothe their babies, but to protect them from whatever force seemed to stalk their dreams. Old women burned copal incense at the edges of the village, muttering that it was not enough. Some families fled altogether, abandoning their homes to settle in distant valleys. Those who stayed learned to live with the strange new rhythm of nights interrupted by crying and whispers that drifted through the air like fog. Through all of this, the stone baby remained unchanged. Its eyes stayed shut, its body still as dead. Yet anyone who had stood near it swore the same thing afterward, that for just a moment when they let their guard down, they had seen its tiny chest rise and fall in the rhythm of a sleeping child.
The fossil did not rest long in the university hall, though professors and officials publicly presented it as a geological curiosity, something to be catalogued and filed away. Their private writings tell a far stranger story. Among them was a foreign geologist named Dr. Karl Brenner, a German who had come to Mexico years earlier to study volcanic formations. He was no stranger to oddities, having spent much of his life cataloging rocks and fossils that confounded explanation. But nothing in his career had prepared him for the stone baby. Brenner had watched quietly as his colleagues argued over its nature. Some called it a hoax, others a miracle, others still a coincidence of stone. He said little, taking notes in his neat handwriting. But the longer he observed the fossil, the more convinced he became that it was not merely an object of curiosity. He was the first to notice, or at least the first to admit, that the fossil seemed to change from day to day in subtle ways. A line at the corner of its mouth one morning would seem deeper the next. Its eyelids, which had appeared tightly shut upon discovery, now seemed only lightly closed, as if they might flutter open at any second. He kept these thoughts to himself, fearing ridicule, but his obsession grew. Late one night, when the university halls were quiet and the guards had gone missing for their usual midnight drinks, Brenner slipped into the chamber where the fossil lay. He brought with him equipment that he had smuggled in over several weeks, a portable X-ray device borrowed from a hospital, notebooks, measuring tools, and a small lantern to cast its pale glow over the stone child. The silence in the room was oppressive, broken only by the faint scratching of his pen and the occasional hum of the machine. When he finally exposed the fossil to the X-ray plates, his heart stopped. He had expected a solid block of mineral, a mere shape hardened into eternity. Instead, the images revealed something impossible. Beneath the stony exterior was a skeleton, small, delicate bones arranged exactly as they would be in a living infant. But they were not calcified fossils. The bones were faintly translucent, as though they were still growing, still developing. The longer he studied the plates, the more disturbed he became, for each exposure seemed slightly different. The rib cage appeared more pronounced in one, the skull more elongated in another, as though the child within was not frozen in time, but continuing to develop beneath its petrified shell. Brenner could scarcely breathe. He repeated the tests again and again, but the results remained the same. He could not share this with his colleagues, not yet. They would dismiss him or worse, steal the discovery for themselves. So he kept the images hidden and redoubled his efforts in secret. Each night he returned, filling page after page with increasingly frantic notes. His writing, once precise and academic, grew jagged, the letters sprawling across the margins as his thoughts raced faster than his hand could keep up. Witnesses later reported strange behavior from the geologist. He stopped eating regularly, slept little, and spoke to himself constantly. When asked what he was studying, he would smile absently and mutter, "The child is waiting." Students noticed he avoided sunlight, preferring to linger in the dim halls of the university. Some claimed they heard him singing lullabies in German as he walked the corridors at night. One evening, a janitor entered the chamber unexpectedly and found Brenner sitting cross-legged before the fossil, his lantern extinguished. The room was nearly dark. Yet Brenner's eyes gleamed with an unnatural light. He was whispering softly, his hands resting upon the stone child's chest. The janitor swore later that he heard another sound in the room, a faint heartbeat, echoing in time with Brenner's words. Terrified, the man fled, and by morning he had resigned his post. Brenner's notes grew more disturbing. He began writing in both Spanish and Mixtec, though he had never studied the latter. Entire passages appeared in languages no one could later identify. In one journal, repeated dozens of times, was a single phrase in shaky letters: El niño se mueve bajo la piedra. El niño recuerda. El niño espera. The child moves beneath the stone. The child remembers. The child waits. By the third month, Brenner ceased leaving the university altogether. His colleagues complained of his absence, but he ignored them. When they attempted to enter the chamber, they found the door locked from within, and Brenner's voice muttering in a low monotone. Some claimed they heard the fossil crying like a living infant. Others said they heard two voices, Brenner's and another, softer one answering him. No one dared to stay long enough to confirm. Finally, one stormy night, shouts echoed through the university halls. Students and professors rushed toward the chamber, but found the door sealed. They hammered at it with fists and shoulders until at last the wood splintered. Inside, the room was in chaos. Brenner's equipment lay shattered across the floor. His notebooks were scattered, pages torn as though by frantic hands. But of the geologist himself, there was no trace. His coat hung neatly on a chair, his boots beside it, but the man was gone. On the wall behind the altar where the fossil rested, words were scrawled in chalk, smeared as though written in haste. El niño nacerá otra vez. The child will be born again. What unsettled the rescuers most, however, was the fossil itself. For the first time since its discovery, its mouth was slightly open, lips parted as though frozen mid-breath. Those who stood nearest swore they felt warm air brush their faces, as if the stone child had exhaled when they entered. The university sealed the chamber after that, locking the fossil away. Brenner was never found. Some believed he had fled, overcome by obsession and shame. Others whispered that he had not fled at all but been taken, pulled into the stone by whatever force pulsed inside. His notes, recovered and studied years later, offered no answers, only madness, pages and pages of lullabies written in German, Mixtec prayers he could not have known, and endless repetitions of the phrase, "The child is waiting." Word of his disappearance spread quickly, fueling rumors across Oaxaca. The villagers who had first unearthed the fossil shook their heads grimly, saying this was what came of disturbing the gifts and curses of the earth. Mothers kept their infants closer than ever, afraid that the stone child might call to them as it had called to Brenner. At night the city itself seemed uneasy. Lamps flickered, cats shrieked in alleys, and more than one nursemaid claimed to hear the sound of a baby crying somewhere within the university walls. The fossil remained locked away, but it was not forgot. Guards assigned to watch the chamber complained of strange dreams, and requested transfers after only a few weeks. Some claimed that when they dozed off, they awoke to find themselves standing before the fossil without memory of having risen. One man resigned in terror after swearing he had seen the stone eyelids twitch open, just as dawn broke, revealing eyes blacker than obsidian. The official records grew quiet after Brenner's disappearance, as though the university wished to bury the incident. But among the people of Oaxaca, the legend only deepened. They told stories of the German, who had tried to measure the unmeasurable and been consumed for his arrogance. They warned that the child beneath the stone was not to be studied or touched, only feared. And yet, in hushed tones, some asked a darker question. If the skeleton inside truly was still growing, how long would it be before the stone could no longer contain it? The professors tried to dismiss the story of Brenner's disappearance, filing it away as the unfortunate breakdown of a foreign eccentric, but the city would not let it rest. Rumors spread through Oaxaca's streets like wildfire. The German had been taken by the stone child. The fossil had opened its mouth and swallowed him whole. He had been pulled into the rock to serve as the baby's guardian, until the time of awakening. Some laughed nervously when they repeated these stories, but their voices always lowered when they spoke them, as though to name the stone child too loudly might draw its attention. It was during this time that elders from the Mixtec villages began to visit the city, not as curious onlookers but as grim heralds, wrapped in woven cloaks, and leaning on canes carved with ancient symbols. They came not to marvel at the fossil but to warn. At first they were ignored, dismissed as superstitious old men clinging to myth, but their persistence unsettled even the most skeptical. They spoke of legends passed down long before the Spaniards arrived, before even the Aztecs held sway. Legends of a child who belonged not to the heavens or to men, but to the earth itself. They called it No Yata Kava, the child of the stone womb. According to their telling, the earth sometimes bore children of its own, not flesh of flesh, but flesh of rock. These beings were rare, born once in many lifetimes, and they carried within them the memory of all that had been taken from the world. They were not meant to live among men, but to awaken only when the balance of life had tilted too far, when people had drawn too greedily from the land, when too much had been stolen from the gods. When that time came, the child would rise from its cradle of rock, and reclaim what was owed. The elders spoke these words in the university hall itself, their voices echoing against stone walls, where the fossil lay locked away. "Do not think of it as dead," one said, his eyes cloudy but fierce. "The earth does not bury its children, it keeps them safe until they are needed." Another added, "The longer it remains above ground, away from its place in the mountain, the more restless it will become. You feed its hunger by keeping it here." The professors scoffed openly, but there was unease in their manner. Some of the students, younger and less hardened, whispered that the elders' words explained much. The strange dreams, the sudden fevers, the way animals avoided the building, but the warnings were ignored, and the fossil remained where it was, sealed away but never forgot. Soon after, the disasters began. At first they were small, the kind of misfortunes a farmer might shrug at. A patch of maize rotting overnight, goats refusing to give milk, chickens laying eggs with soft crumbling shells. But the misfortunes multiplied. Whole fields withered to dust, though the rains fell steady. Rivers that had run for generations shrank to trickles. Wells went dry. In the mountain villages, mothers miscarried at alarming rates, while infants who had been born strong wasted away within weeks. It was as if something unseen was leeching the life out of the valley. Each calamity was answered with whispers of the stone child. People said it was feeding, stretching in its stone cradle, drawing the vitality of the living into itself. Offerings began to appear again, not only in the city but throughout the countryside. Bowls of maize, cups of milk, tiny dolls carved from wood were placed at cave mouths and riverbeds. Some families left swaddled bundles of cloth at crossroads, as though to trick the child into taking the decoy instead of their real babies. Earthquakes came next. They were small at first, tremors that rattled cups and shuttered doors. But as the weeks passed, the tremors grew, always centered near Oaxaca, always strongest in the dead of night. People woke to the sound of the ground moaning, as if something beneath was shifting, pushing against the surface. Entire households fled into the streets, praying as they clutched each other under the swaying sky. Priests led processions with candles, singing hymns, but the earth answered with another jolt, tossing icons to the floor of their churches. One particular quake struck during a mass. The congregation had gathered to beg for relief from the disasters, the priest raising his hands in prayer before the altar. As his voice rose, the ground buckled violently, and the statue of the Virgin toppled from its niche, shattering on the floor. Gasps filled the church, but louder still was the sound that followed, a deep resonant thud beneath their feet, as though something massive had stirred within the earth itself. Women screamed, men dragged their children into the street. When the quake subsided, the priest fell to his knees and admitted that their prayers alone could not contain what was rising. The villagers returned to the Mixtec elders, pleading for guidance. The old men shook their heads gravely. "It is already awake," one said. "What you feel now is only the stretching of its limbs. When it opens its eyes, the world will change." They advised the people to leave offerings, to honor the child as one would honor a god, for if it awoke angry, no prayer could save them. Stories multiplied, carried from mouth to mouth across Oaxaca. A shepherd claimed to see a small figure walking the hillside at dawn. its skin the color of stone, its eyes black and endless. A mother swore that as she nursed her child, she heard another infant's cry, echoing faintly from within the earth. Fishermen reported that rivers sang at night, low wails like a baby's call, and that fish turned belly up in the water dead by morning. In Oaxaca City, officials tried to dismiss the reports, but even the most skeptical could not deny the mounting evidence. Scholars who dared to examine the fossil again reported that it seemed subtly altered, its hands less tightly curled, its lips parted wider than before. When one brave professor pressed his hand to its chest, he recoiled instantly, swearing that he had felt the unmistakable flutter of a heartbeat. The Mixtec legends resurfaced with new urgency. Elders told of times long ago when the child had emerged to walk among men. Crops failed, villages vanished, and children disappeared into the earth, never to return. Only through ritual offerings had the child been appeased, coaxed back into slumber. But even then, it was said, the reprieve lasted only until the child grew restless once more. "This one is different," an elder whispered. "This one is stronger. The earth has been wounded too much. It does not want to sleep again." In the city, panic grew. Some demanded the fossil be destroyed, though none could say how. Others insisted it be returned to the mountains, buried deep where no man could find it again. Still others argued that it should be worshipped, given offerings openly, lest worse calamities come. Riots broke out in the markets, parents clashing with scholars, soldiers struggling to keep order. Through it all, the fossil remained silent, locked in its chamber. Yet anyone who stood near it swore they could feel the air shift, hear the faintest sound of breath, and if they dared to listen long enough, the softest, most terrible thing of all, the quiet murmur of a child learning to speak. When the university could no longer contain the panic, they sought a solution that would appear decisive, even if they did not believe it themselves. The fossil, they declared, would be sealed away permanently. A special chamber would be built beneath the old convent at the edge of Oaxaca, its walls fortified with stone and iron, its doors locked with 3 keys held by different men so that no one person could ever open it alone. The public was told that this would restore order, that locking the fossil underground would break the chain of disasters, as though a problem of myth could be solved with bricks and mortar. The day of the sealing became an event in itself. Crowds gathered in the square, many bringing candles, rosaries or charms. Some wept openly as the fossil, wrapped in heavy cloth and bound with iron bands, was carried through the streets on a cart drawn by oxen. Others spat at the scholars walking alongside it, blaming them for having disturbed it in the first place. The oxen balked repeatedly, refusing to move, and at one point, a driver raised his whip to strike, only to have the lash catch mid-air, as if seized by invisible fingers. The whip fell harmlessly from his hands. A silence rippled through the crowd. Even the skeptics lowered their eyes, unwilling to tempt whatever force had made its displeasure known. The convent vault had been prepared with great care. Workers dug deep, layering stone upon stone, embedding crucifixes into the walls, even painting prayers in lime wash across the ceilings. When the fossil was lowered into the chamber, the air grew heavy and damp, and several of the men swore they felt the ground tremble beneath their feet. A priest stepped forward, sprinkling holy water, chanting as he circled the swaddled fossil. But halfway through the blessing, the candles extinguished themselves. Darkness swallowed the chamber. Men scrambled for flints, but no spark would catch. Only when the great iron door slammed shut with a deafening clang, did the candles flare back to life on their own, burning blue for a moment, before settling into normal flame. The vault was sealed, the keys distributed, and the scholars announced to the city that the danger had passed. For a short while it seemed as though they were right. The tremors ceased, the crops revived, drinking greedily from the soil. Infants born after the sealing grew strong and healthy. Rivers began to run clear again, as if nothing had ever been wrong. Relief settled like rain over the city, and for the first time in months, laughter returned to Oaxaca's streets. But the relief was not complete. A quiet dread lingered beneath the surface, like an ache in the bone that never fully heals. Parents still warned their children not to wander near the convent. Farmers, when their plows struck stone, whispered apologies before digging further. And in the still hours of night, when the city lay hushed under the weight of the stars, those who lived closest to the convent swore they heard something faint, not a cry, not a groan, but the muffled sound of a heartbeat,
slow and steady, echoing through the ground. Decades passed, generations turned, and the story of the stone child slipped into legend. The vault beneath the convent was largely forgotten, spoken of only by old men on festival nights, or by women warning their grandchildren not to mock the earth. Scholars from later years dismissed it all as folklore, a tale exaggerated by famine and fear. But the keys remained. 3 families kept them, passing them down quietly, each generation warning the next never to let the locks be opened, never to let the fossil see the light again. Then came the revolution. Oaxaca, like much of Mexico, was torn apart by fighting. Churches burned, convents ransacked, vaults cracked open in search of treasure. The old convent that had hidden the fossil was not spared. Its doors were battered down, its cloisters stripped. Rebels turned it into a barracks, then abandoned it when supplies ran low. In the chaos, the vault was nearly forgotten. Nearly. One night, under a sky split with lightning, looters searching for silver forced their way into the vault. The doors, which should have been immovable, swung open easily, as though the iron had rusted from within. The men carried lanterns, their flames quivering in the damp air, and when they reached the heart of the chamber, they found nothing but a hollow space. The stone child was gone. The wrappings, the iron bands, even the stone pedestal, all had vanished. Only the faint outline of a cradle remained etched into the floor, as if the weight of the fossil had pressed itself into the rock. The looters fled, leaving their lanterns behind. In the days that followed, Oaxaca was racked by strange events once again. A church collapsed without warning, its bell tolling as it fell. A caravan of mules turned up dead, their bodies unmarked, their eyes wide open. Infants disappeared from cradles in 3 villages, their mothers swearing they had seen the blankets twitch as if lifted by unseen hands. Earthquakes shook the valley, not violent but constant, like the footsteps of something small but heavy moving just beneath the surface. The vault was searched, but no trace of the fossil was found. The scholars who still lived offered no explanation, and many fled the city, rather than face the whispers that grew louder with every disaster. The 3 families who had guarded the keys went silent, some vanishing entirely, their homes abandoned, their possessions left as though they had left in great haste. Yet even in their silence, the legend grew. Farmers claimed to see a child-shaped figure walking through their fields at dusk, its body dull and gray like granite, its eyes gleaming faintly in the fading light. Shepherds spoke of hearing a baby's laughter echo across empty hillsides, only to find their flocks reduced to piles of bone by morning. Mothers told their children to keep stones out of their beds, for fear that the child of the earth might crawl in to sleep beside them. The elders, now frail and few, gave one final warning: it will not return to stone, not this time. It has chosen its place among men. Wherever it walks, the land will remember what was taken, and it will keep walking until the debt is paid. From that day forward, the fossil of the stone baby was never seen again. Some say it lies buried once more, deep in the mountains, cradled by the earth that bore it. Others believe it still walks, appearing only in times of imbalance, when the land itself has grown restless with hunger. But in Oaxaca, when the ground trembles without warning, or when an infant's cry rings out from the darkness where no child can be found, people still lower their voices and cross themselves, whispering of the child that was never meant to exist and yet somehow died. When whispers of the stone baby should have ended with its disappearance from Oaxaca, they did not. Instead, the stories carried themselves like seeds caught on the wind, spreading from village to village, across mountains and valleys, until even those who had never set foot in Oaxaca spoke of it in hushed tone. What had once been a localized curse began to sound like something older, wider, as though the fossil was not a singular mystery, but merely the first glimpse of something much larger. Travelers brought back accounts from distant places that echoed the Oaxacan nightmare. A miner in Peru claimed that while tunneling into the Andes, he unearthed a small, perfectly shaped stone fetus, embedded within a quartz vein. Terrified, he buried it again and abandoned the mine. But a week later, a landslide buried his village under rock and ash, sparing only the mountain where he had made his discovery. In Guatemala, a farmer digging a new well struck something solid that rang like iron beneath the earth. When he exposed it, he swore he saw the curled shape of a child pressed into the rock, its face worn smooth by time. That same night his fields caught fire without spark or lightning, burning his harvest to dust. Stories came from Europe too, buried deep in archives that had long been ignored. In an 18th century Spanish manuscript, a missionary wrote of encountering stone infants in the Yucatan, strange fossilized shapes that the Maya regarded as omens of imbalance between gods and men. He had dismissed them as primitive superstition, until he noted in a trembling hand, an earthquake swallowed half of a mission 2 days after he had disturbed one of the stones. Another account, found in a library in Madrid, spoke of a fossil unearthed in the Pyrenees, shaped like a swaddled child but with no skull, only a hollow cavity where a head should be. The village that had displayed it in their church as a curiosity was later erased by a flood no one could explain. The further scholars looked, the more impossible coincidences they uncovered. In China, temple records spoke of earthborn children discovered by farmers along riverbanks during Great Drought. In Siberia, explorers described finding a child-shaped stone buried in permafrost, only to abandon it when wolves stalked their camp for weeks without rest. The accounts spanned centuries, languages, and continents, yet the pattern was unmistakable. Whenever one of these children was unearthed, the land around it turned violent, exacting a punishment that grew until the object was hidden again. It became clear that Oaxaca's stone baby was not unique. It was part of a pattern, a web of mysteries, stretching across the world, appearing in places where earth, time and suffering collided. Some argued they were not fossils at all but manifestations of something older than humanity, crystallized in rock when balance between man and land was broken. Others claimed they were warnings, markers left behind by civilizations far older than any remembered, relics of a past long forgotten. But beneath every theory was the same question: why children? Why did the earth take on the form of infants, helpless and innocent? Was it meant to inspire mercy in those who found them, or was it the cruelest form of mockery, a reminder of humanity's fragility against the vastness of the soil and stone that birthed it? No one could say for certain. What unnerved investigators most was not the past but the present. Reports emerged that the tremors in Oaxaca had never truly stopped. Generations after the fossil vanished, farmers still swore they heard the sound of tiny hands tapping from beneath the soil like someone knocking to be let out. Mothers reported strange visitations in the night, cradles rocking on their own, the sound of an infant crying in an empty room, pebbles inexplicably appearing beneath blankets where their babies should have been. And then the stories spread further. A scientist cataloging seismic activity in Chile recorded a series of rhythmic tremors that matched the cadence of a heartbeat, echoing underground for nearly 3 hours before vanishing without explanation. In Iceland, hikers found a trail of small footprints pressed into hardened lava, leading into a fissure but never emerging. In the deserts of Australia, an anthropologist discovered an ancient rock carving of a child-shaped figure surrounded by waves of stone, as if the land itself had risen to cradle it. The implication became unavoidable. These stone children were not artifacts of the past. They were still here, perhaps waiting beneath us, surfacing only when the earth itself felt it had been wronged. Oaxaca had merely been one chapter in a story that spanned continents and centuries. Some scholars, unwilling to publish openly, shared a chilling hypothesis in private. They argued that the children were not separate fossils, but fragments of one being, pieces of a larger whole that had been scattered across the earth like seeds. When one piece was unearthed, the others stirred, sending ripples of imbalance through the ground. If this was true, then the disappearance of Oaxaca's stone baby did not mark its end, but its return to whatever whole it belonged to. And if enough of these fragments were uncovered, or worse, reunited, then what Oaxaca had suffered would be only a whisper compared to the scream that would follow. Even now in the 21st century, there are places where the earth seems to remember. Seismologists studying unexplained microtremors describe them as pulses, though some admit off the record that they sound eerily like a fetal heartbeat. Archaeologists quietly redact discoveries of child-shaped fossils from their reports, fearing ridicule or worse. And in Oaxaca, where it all began, the oldest families still lower their voices when the ground shakes, still keep stones out of their children's cradles, and still light candles when an infant falls ill without cause. The story has become a warning, whispered through generations. The earth is alive, and it remembers. Its children are buried all around us, waiting, and when they rise, they do not come to play, nor to comfort. They come to remind us that nothing dug from the ground is ever truly gone, and that the soil we walk upon is not only beneath us, it is watching. And so the legend endures. The Stone Baby of Oaxaca was not the first, nor the last. Somewhere in the silent dark, more weight curled tightly in the womb of the earth. And one day, if we are careless enough to awaken them all, we will learn what it means when the planet takes back what it once bore. And that concludes the haunting mystery of the Stone Baby of Oaxaca, a fossil that shouldn't exist, a story that began in a quiet Mexican village and grew into a riddle stretching across the world, leaving behind whispers of earthquakes, curses, and impossible fossil. Was it truly just stone, or something far older, far darker, waiting beneath our feet? The truth may never be fully uncovered, but one thing is certain. Legends like this remind us that the earth holds secrets it may never want us to understand. If you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of crime, horror, and history's strangest mysteries. And now we want to hear from you. What do you think the Stone Baby really was? A fossil, a curse, or something the earth itself created to warn us? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, some mysteries are buried for a reason.